Police say so far this month, 11 women have been killed in Juarez.
The unit that investigates crimes against women across our border is releasing some new numbers.
The 2 women who were killed and found dismembered.
The body of a young woman. The woman's body was found.
In 1995, law enforcement in the city of Juarez made a gruesome discovery. A mass grave that contained the bodies of women who'd been systematically brutalized. Many had their hands tied behind their backs and displayed signs that they had been sexually assaulted. Investigators also noticed a disturbing clue as to who may have been responsible for the killings. Several of the bodies had a triangle carved into their backs. These didn't just look like murders. These looked like ritual killings. These women had been tortured.
Every week since his daughter disappeared more than a year ago, Gaspar Mendoza has waited outside the state prosecutor's office in Ciudad Juarez, looking for help.
A year later, another one of these mass graves was discovered that contained the bodies of women and even teenage girls who had been horrifically tortured and murdered. In the coming months and years, a total of 5 mass graves were discovered in and around the city of Juarez. But as law enforcement agencies on both sides of the borders searched for answers, more women and teenage girls were going missing. Some of their bodies had been drowned in seedy hotel bathrooms, disregarded in the deserts, or mutilated on the outskirts of poor neighborhoods. Since the discovery of the first mass graves in 1995, the bodies of hundreds of women, some bearing strange symbols carved into them, have been discovered. Hundreds of other women and teenage girls have vanished from the streets while walking to school or work, never to be heard from again. My name is Vincent Vargas. I am the host of the Borderland podcast, an Ironclad original, and I am a Border Patrol Search, Trauma, and Rescue Unit veteran with years of experience working on the U.S.-Mexico border. On the southern border, there is a legal concept known as reasonable fear. If an asylum officer determines that a migrant has a reasonable fear of persecution or torture if returned to their home country, then removal procedures can be delayed. And in the current border crisis, there has been no greater source of reasonable fear cases than the Mexican drug cartels. In each episode of this special Borderland docuseries, Reasonable Fear, I take a deep dive into the border crisis to find the primary players behind the violence, the scope of these transnational criminal enterprises, and the state of the narco wars.
This was a group of powerful people.
Never been seen before in Mexico.
Evidence of ritualistic elements.
We ended up rescuing almost 200 kids.
The discovery of multiple women in mass graves.
They're almost in every state.
When you put it together, you have an economic extortion map.
But even more violent.
Episode 1, The Missing Women of Juarez. One of the key elements to understanding this story and who might be behind these crimes involves understanding the unique role Juarez plays in the Mexican economy. Situated directly across the border from El Paso, a safe, thriving Texas community, Juarez is a key crossing point with residents of both cities regularly commuting back and forth. However, even though they are geographically close, in many ways, they couldn't be further apart.
So, there was some, maybe it's Porfirio Diaz, one of the Mexican presidents, said something like, poor Mexico, so close to the United States and so far from God. And I always thought that was an interesting quote, particularly as it refers to Juarez.
That's journalist Oz Woloshyn. He spent years investigating the murders there and is the host of the award-winning 10-part podcast called Forgotten: Women of Juarez that takes a deep dive into the crimes. As he explains, for most of its modern history, Juarez has had deep ties to the criminal underworld on both sides of the border.
The reason one of the famous margarita bars in Juarez is called the Kentucky Club is because during Prohibition, there was a whiskey distillery in Kentucky that got taken apart piece by piece and shipped by rail to Juarez, where it was rebuilt. And it became, a distillery in Juarez, specifically for the purpose of exporting, smuggling whiskey into the US. And so that kind of was a perfect story, but also a perfect metaphor for how Juarez has become a place where stuff which the US wants, but doesn't want to acknowledge that it wants, or how the sausage is made, takes place. And so whether that is cheap manufacturing of electronic goods or stuff to do with the auto industry, or of course drug trafficking, it's become kind of the story of Juarez.
Today, Juarez is home to more than 300 industrial manufacturing operations known as maquiladoras that produce products ranging from consumer electronics to parts for automotive brands. They employ more than 250,000 people, many of whom are women. However, the workers make a fraction of what they would in the United States, but the steady wages are still enough to draw people from across impoverished areas of rural Mexico. Many of them are teenage girls with few contacts in the city of Juarez.
In the case of the Juarez murders, people were moving from all over Mexico. In some cases, there would be planes laid on by multinational factories into the center of Mexico to basically bring people to the border to work in these factories, kind of like the grapes of wrath in the Steinbeck era. But once they arrived, there was no infrastructure, no protection. And at the same time, you had all of the organized crime elements who were in Juarez because of the proximity to the smuggling routes. And so you had this unmoored population of working class people who'd come to work in factories, having their children in Juarez, and that male children in many cases were victims of being recruited into cartels, and their female children were in many cases victims of horrific sexualized murders. And so kind of particularly tragic economic trap that arose in Juarez.
The girls who worked in these factories often started their shifts very early in the morning and begun their commutes into work when it was still dark out. And because they knew few people in the area, when one would suddenly not show up or seemingly go missing, outside of a few family members, no one was looking for them. As more mass graves began to be discovered, the bodies of more girls and young women were being found through the city, many carrying the same strange signs of ritual violence. It became more clear how the killer was finding victims. The next question was to figure out who was killing the women and girls of Juarez. Police in Juarez began to openly investigate the possibility that they were dealing with the works of a serial killer, possibly operating out of the United States.
There was evidence of ritualistic elements to some of the murders, and particularly discovery of multiple women in mass graves. And so, at the same time, the serial killer is definitely not uniquely North American phenomenon, but the concept of multiple victims killed in very specific ways, in kind of 20th century culture is very associated with this kind of, again, Anglo-American, like specific character who kind of hunts for women and kills them, in a very specific way. And so, in the early days of these discoveries, there was a lot of fear that American serial killers, one, maybe more than one, were crossing the border to prey on vulnerable women.
However, as more bodies began to be discovered, the volume of violence soon made evident that this wasn't the work of a single killer. Over time, public outrage and concern grew on both sides of the border, and pressure mounted on Mexican law enforcement to make arrests. Police refocused their investigations around the factories where many of the young female employees had worked before going missing. Most factory employees lived in small nearby communities and relied on buses for transportation. Investigators had a suspicion. Maybe the bus drivers who interacted with the women and girls on a daily basis were the ones behind the killings.
On the outskirts of Juarez and these townships or suburbs where these women lived, and would bus them first into the center of Juarez, where they would change, and then often onto another bus which would take them to where the factory was. And so in many cases, the last people these women would see alive were the bus drivers.
Police started to interview drivers, and not long after, they made their first arrest.
And after the discovery of one of the mass graves, 2 bus drivers were arrested and paraded by the police as the killers. The case closed.
However, soon the public realized something didn't add up. Despite initially confessing to the killings, not long after their arrest, the 2 men recanted. It turned out that both of them had been forced into the confessions.
These bus drivers were beaten, electrocuted, burned with cigarettes on their genitals, essentially tortured within an inch of their lives to claim responsibility for these crimes. And so what you have to ask was, why were the police so keen, so desperate to torture these poor men into confessing to crimes they didn't commit?
As Oz points out, the forced confessions led to more questions than answers.
Officials are warning of a widespread cybersecurity attack.
Frustrations and delays have continued as countless are still without power.
Market volatility is at its highest since the
There are a
pandemic.
number of reports across the state.
Unidentified crashing news. There is no doubt our grid is at risk.
The market is taking seriously.
But in these cases, the incentives to solve these murders were not really there. These were poor women who didn't have influential relatives or people with money who were trying to really figure out what was going on. And so the downside, I think, for these crimes being solved was, in the eyes of many, sadly, probably even in law enforcement, bigger than the upside of solving them. And so, it was a tragedy where, in many cases, powerful people who were involved in these crimes were also involved in other forms of corruption that included, in some cases, Mexican law enforcement.
Suspicion began to grow that perhaps law enforcement or other influential institutions may have actually been involved. And when one of the men died in police custody and one of their primary lawyers was murdered on the streets, investigative journalists began to wonder if some of the most powerful forces in Mexico could actually be connected to the crimes.
My name is Lydia Cacho. I am a Mexican journalist and a human rights activist. I have been working as an investigative reporter for 36 years in Mexico and in 143 countries, investigating gender violence and violence against children all over the world. And I specialized in organized crime almost 20 years ago. I have done many investigations on the human trafficking, on child pornography, and many of my books cover these issues. And some of my work have helped put a lot of very dangerous criminals, especially files, in jail, not only in Mexico, but in other countries. So I move around, and obviously this kind of mobsters, these kind of mafias don't like me. I have been threatened for a long time. I survived 7 death threats and attempts to kill me.
Que ahí mismo también vamos a entregar esta denuncia formal. Mario Marín está amenazado.
Lydia Cacho is an infamous figure in Mexico, and if there's anyone who had reason to believe that a conspiracy that could extend beyond law enforcement could be afoot, it'd be her. In fact, her reporting had uncovered a pedophile ring that involved the highest levels of Mexican society in Cancun, and it almost cost her life.
That I met some victims of a child pornography network. Apparently was only a lonely pedophile, a millionaire Lebanese Mexican guy that was living in Cancun in a very fancy hotel. He was the owner of this hotel, and I met this young girl. She had been abused since she was 13 years old. And then once I started investigating more and more, they immediately threatened my life. They sent someone with a gun. They asked me to stop investigating. And I had a TV show back then and locally in Cancun, and I just kept going. And I said, you cannot stop me. So I kept publishing even the death threats. And then I met all these children, and then we ended up with my team rescuing almost 200 kids. And most of them had been abused since they were 3 or 4 or 5 years. So I decided to go into the deep web. Back then in 2003, most people didn't even know what the deep web was. So I got in touch with a hacker, a very young guy, and he taught me how to do it. So I started getting all this evidence that I later used in court to demonstrate what these guys were doing. They were buying and selling children from Mexico, from Florida, and from other countries in Latin America, like Paraguay and El Salvador, and they were selling them to this businessman for $3,000. So I have this phone calls recorded of these two guys that were discussing the price of one girl that they were bringing from Florida, helped by the mafias of pedophiles in Florida, obviously. And then I published a book, and well, it was really interesting because on one hand, a lot of people understood what was going on thanks to my work and the work of other colleagues that started covering the issue. And I was obsessed, absolutely obsessed. And you understand this because you've been there investigating and you know, watching things unravel. I thought this is so important. I need Mexican people or my readers to understand this is not a small group of guys that are doing sex trafficking, human trafficking with little children, and especially little girls. This is an enormous network of people that are doing this around the world, and they are also laundering money, and they are doing political favors to each other and to other powerful people. So they create this network of protection, political protection and judicial protection. So I kept going, and then they kidnapped me. The police kidnapped me and put me in jail and tortured me for 24 hours, tried to get me to confess that my book was full of lies, and I didn't. And then they put them in jail.
Lydia and others knew that the police themselves could be involved in the murders, or at least covering them up. The cartels, which were growing in power throughout the country, had become masters of manipulation and corrupting public officials.
It's money and it's the threat of violence. It's the carrot and the stick. You know, you do this, you're our guy. You turn a blind eye on this, you know, container going by. It's $250, and the ask gets bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more gruesome, and more difficult to say no to. And if you start to accept the smaller bites, when you turn around and think, "Oh my goodness, I don't want to do this anymore," you're the frog in the pot, and maybe the incentives at that point change from, you know, we'll give you this to do that, to we'll kill you if you don't do this. And so I think it's a well-worn path. Very few people, I think, when they take their first, you know, element of being corrupted, imagine how deep and terrifying and how compromised they will become in a very short time.
With investigations drying up, journalists like Lydia started to look for clues, even as police attempted to point fingers at innocent people.
The cartels in Mexico back then were really powerful in northern Mexico, basically. Chihuahua, Sinaloa, even Monterrey, even though, and Reynosa and all that. So they were ruling that part of Mexico, and they were controlling the border from Mexico, obviously from the Mexican side, regarding drugs and everything. But they were also dealing with the prostitution and human trafficking. Back then, people were not covering this. I mean, it was not recognized as a crime by the international community, nor by the governments. So nobody really understood this. People thought that these young women wanted to cross the border from Mexico, or go from other countries in Central America, or from Mexico tourist area to the north of Mexico to work in these maquiladoras that were doing this, shoes and things for like big names in the U.S. So big brands. I'm sorry. So what happened was that some of these very, very young women were working in this network of maquiladoras all over the north of Mexico, but mainly there in Ciudad Juarez. And the Cartel of Juarez was there, like in real control of the whole thing. So what happened was we documented back then there was a lot of forced labor that people were not talking about it, and the government was not recognizing it, because the Mexican government back in '94 and the local government of Chihuahua was really happy that they had all these new maquiladoras all over the place, and they were, they were producing things and sending them to the U.S. And so it was bringing money to Mexico, right? It was good for the economy. So they looked away when people started saying, "Hey, there's forced labor here. There's very young women working here." And so anyway, that was the context. And then when I started documenting the first bodies that were found in the desert of Juarez, they were 15 and 16-year-old girls, and most of them look alike. So some journalists, especially from the U.S., started, lying about it and saying that this was like
a serial killer,
a serial killer or something like that. It wasn't the case. So the Mexican police thought, "Hey, this is great. We have a serial killer, theory, and we will go after it and get this guy." They actually got this a poor innocent man from Egypt called the Egyptian. They called him that, and they put him in jail, and they accused him of, of crimes he didn't commit. And they thought, this is it, so people won't worry about it, because this is young women and they are poor and nobody really knows about them, and it's northern Mexico, right? But then some of these crimes started happening in certain areas of Juarez, the areas that were controlled by the drug lords there, by the cartels. And that's when we started investigating that and seeing all the links between them and between, obviously, some members of the government back then in Mexico. Because as you know, and your audience knows, the Mexican cartels would not be as powerful as they are if it weren't because of the complicity of some very important politicians in Mexico.
A major break came when the lawyer representing one of the bus drivers tipped off a prominent Mexican crime journalist to something he had heard from a cartel member in prison.
The lawyer who I mentioned, who was murdered, was a source for a journalist called Alfredo Corchado. And he knew that he was going to die, but set Alfredo up with a very important conversation with a source who basically told him, look, these women are being murdered as, ritualistic sexual crimes by members of organized crime to celebrate successful drug busts.
Soon, other journalists began to investigate the claims, and some of the early clues began to make sense. The ritualistic nature of the killings, the symbols carved on the bodies, the sexualized violence. They all pointed to a similar conclusion. Powerful cartels were systematically organizing the abductions, using the girls in sadistic ceremonies to celebrate major drug runs. And because the cartel's corruption had become such an entrenched part of Mexico's political and social power structure, other elite members of the business and political community were also taking part in the sadistic ritualized violence. Journalist Diana Washington Valdez, famous for her book Killing Fields, Harvest of Women, and her deep investigations into the murders, told NPR in 2003.
But has international pressure caused any significant new arrests? Diana Washington Valdez says no, and she thinks she knows why. The investigative reporter for the El Paso Times has covered the so-called femicides for 3 years. She's written a forthcoming book about her reporting titled Harvest of Women, an excerpt of which recently ran in the Mexico City daily La Jornada.
Who do you think is killing the women of Juarez?
We have several prominent men in Mexico who've been identified by several investigations. And their involvement has been corroborated by people in the community.
She talks as she drives through the streets of this Americanized desert metropolis dotted with Wendy's and Blockbusters.
The best information we have is that these men are committing the crimes simply for the sport of it. We know of people who've told stories about escaping from certain parties, orgies, which some of these people were present. They were recognizable people from the Juarez society, from the Mexican society, you might say.
According to this theory, which she was the first to write about, some of the victims were not kidnapped off the streets. They were carefully selected for their appearance, young, slender, dark complexion, then invited to a restaurant or bar, and ultimately brought to free-for-all parties, which ended in violent death and mutilation. In her reports, she names the young scions variously referred to as Los Juniors and Los Intocables, the Untouchables, who she claims have ties to the Juarez drug cartel. She says low-level operatives, including police officers, procured some of the girls and helped dispose of the bodies. She claims that certain Mexican investigators had promising leads on Los Juniors, which they wanted to pursue, but they were blocked by authorities in the state attorney general's office.
The authorities know who the killers are, and nothing's being done about it. We have two issues here. We have people who are getting away with murder, and we have authorities who have become accomplices, and so this has become now crimes of the state.
The allegations have been explosive in this industrial city of more than 1 million people, akin to naming Rockefellers or DuPonts as serial killers in the U.S.
We have two issues here: people who are getting away with murder and authorities who have become accomplices. And so this has become crimes of the state.
The theory, Diana Washington Valdez, which is not a mutually exclusive theory. I mean, you have to remember there are hundreds of young women disappearing and being murdered in Juarez. So not every theory is mutually exclusive. Diana had her reporting uncovered or suggested that some of the children of the wealthy industrialists in Juarez may, in a sense, be doing something very similar to what the members of the cartel were doing, which was also abducting women and having them brought to remote ranches, essentially using them in sexualized celebrations and then disposing of their bodies. I think both theories point to the same thing, which is that, men with money and power in this context were able to treat women without money and power as disposable objects. And by virtue of the impunity, to get away with it and to continue doing it and to perpetuate it. Something like this can be like a metastatic cancer. Once it starts and people realize they can get away with it, who's to say others don't imitate their behavior? This is a story where, the murders happen in Mexico, and it's this story which has been used, I think, by some to kind of vilify Mexicans or to in some sense, have some sense of moral superiority. Like, it couldn't happen here. And I think because of the rule of law, it couldn't happen in exactly the same way here. But I think analogs of it happen all the time. You mentioned Epstein, that, this was a group of powerful people turning a blind eye, or even in some case, participating in a pedophile ring in New York City and Palm Beach, two of the most centers of power and wealth in this country, and very prominent people being involved. And yes, I think the ability of humanity to be cruel and callous and self-interested and to dehumanize others based on position of relative power is ubiquitous.
And as Lydia Cacho explains, once the cartel and wealthy power brokers began getting away with their crimes, others were able to conceal their own violent acts against women.
Some of the young girls that were assassinated by these guys were brought by the cartels, and they were exploited by the cartels, and then when they tried to run, they killed them, some of them. And then once they started dropping the bodies in the desert, it became a trademark of the cartels, right, of the criminal networks. So then we also had a lot of domestic violence back then in that area. And a lot of men that kill their partners, not even their wives, but also their girlfriends, because they were really young. They decided that if they dropped the body in the desert, then they did a copycat thing, then the government would go like, oh no, this is organized crime, so we won't touch this. So that was pretty much, it's a combination of the whole thing. Is that, as you know, we call it the law of impunity. Once you know that you can do certain things that will make policemen think that this is an organized crime network involved in the crime, then they will behave differently, because in some of the cases, most of the cases, they didn't want to get involved, because Mexico didn't even have a really strong police force against organized crime back in '94. Then it did, and they have done incredible work. But back then we didn't have that. And I mean, sexual exploitation was a crime, but we didn't even name it as, not even the US, like sex trafficking, human trafficking. We didn't have the strong laws that we have now. Even for child pornography in 2003, when I published my book, it was incredible that a lawyer called me and he said, if they get this guy, the child pornographer that has exploited more than 200 children, he might not be sentenced as he should, because there is no law in Mexico, specific law against child pornography production. So we created the law.
By some estimates, there has been nearly 1,500 women and girls who have gone missing or have been found murdered in Juarez since the first mass graves were discovered at the beginning of what has become recognized as a mass femicide. But thanks to the work of journalists like Lydia Cacho and others, public awareness and outrage has triggered a more thorough response from law enforcement as pressure from international communities has grown. Though violence is still not uncommon. The maquiladoras have also made significant changes in their efforts to improve the working conditions for their employees and also protect women and girls from violence. However, since the murders and abductions, cartel influence and power has only grown on both sides of the border. Today, if you visit Juarez, it is not uncommon to come across pink crosses that serve not only as a reminder to the evil perpetrated against these women and girls, but also for the victims who lost their lives to a system of corruption and exploitation. But one of the other legacies of the femicide in Juarez is that it revealed that powerful people, from cartel leaders to sex traffickers like Jeffrey Epstein, will find ways to conceal their crimes and prey on society's most vulnerable, if we let them get away with it. My name is Vince Vargas. Thank you for watching Reasonable Fear, a Borderlands special series, an Ironclad original. Be sure to check out @This is Ironclad on YouTube for more from this series, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.